Still taking public transport? My mother asked, her voice cutting through the kitchen like a blade wrapped in concern. Your sister has 3 cars, you know. A Tesla, a Range Rover, and that new Mercedes. Dad smirked from his position at the breakfast table, the one where he'd been sitting every Thanksgiving for the past 15 years, waiting for the annual opportunity to inventory my failures. I checked my watch silently, 11:43 a.m., and wondered how much longer they would maintain this particular version of me before the truth arrived to demolish it. The problem with being the disappointment in a family of achievers is that the role becomes almost comfortable. It's a narrative that everyone understands. The parents play concerned, offering unsolicited advice wrapped in sympathy. The successful sibling plays magnanimous, occasionally reminding you of their achievements through humble bragging that they've perfected over years of practice. The failure plays gracious, grateful for the crumbs of acknowledgement that occasionally fall from the table of family approval. We all know our lines. We've rehearsed them for years. We could perform them in our sleep. But what happens when someone decides to completely rewrite the script? What happens when the designated failure decides to become so successful that the entire narrative collapses under the weight of its own inaccuracy? I'd been rewriting mine for the past decade, and nobody had noticed because I'd made absolutely certain that they wouldn't. It had required discipline. It had required lying to people I loved. It had required me to accept a diminished version of myself every single time I walked through my parents' door. But it had been worth it. Every bit of it. Thanksgiving at my parents' house in Westchester had always been a particular kind of performance. It was choreographed. It was predictable. It was designed to reinforce a very specific hierarchy of success, one where my father's business acumen was paramount, where my sister's medical credentials were impressive, and where my choices were a cautionary tale. The house itself was a statement, a 4-bedroom colonial that my father had purchased in 1989 and spent the next 30 years reminding everyone about. My mother had decorated it with the kind of precision that suggested she was preparing not a home but a museum exhibit titled Wealth and Respectability. Everything matched. Everything gleamed. Everything broadcast the specific message that they had made good decisions and other people had not. My sister Catherine had made good decisions. She was a cardiac surgeon with a practice in Manhattan, the kind of doctor who appeared on the cover of medical journals and got quoted in the New York Times about breakthrough procedures. She drove a white Tesla Model S that she'd mentioned approximately 7,000 times in the past 6 months, as if the mere ownership of it were evidence of superior life choices. She had a husband named Douglas who worked in hedge funds and never said very much because anything he said would immediately be ranked against Catherine's achievements and found wanting. They had 2 precocious children who were already being groomed for Ivy League futures. And then there was me. I was 31 years old, and according to my family's established narrative, I was what happened when significant promise met poor life choices in a head-on collision. I dropped out of an MBA program at Northwestern because I decided to pursue something in transportation logistics, a phrase that made my parents exchange the kind of looks that suggested I just announced plans to become a fortune teller or join a cult. I'd spent the last decade building a company that I deliberately kept invisible, operating under a corporate structure so deliberately obscure that my own family had no idea what I actually did or how much money I actually made. Public transportation is actually quite efficient, I said mildly, reaching for another roll. You'd be surprised how much infrastructure goes into making it work. The logistics alone, the scheduling, the route optimization, the real-time tracking systems, it's actually incredibly complex. My mother exchanged a glance with my father that I'd seen 1,000 times before. This was clearly not the response they'd been hoping for. They'd expected me to get defensive. They'd expected apologies. They expected me to justify my failure in a way that would allow them to continue feeling concerned and magnanimous. Efficiency isn't the point, honey, my mother said, her hand reaching across the table to pat mine with that particular practiced compassion she perfected over 3 decades of motherhood. The point is that you should want more for yourself. The point is that you should be thinking about your future. You should want a car. You should want what, exactly? I asked. Everything, my father said, with the particular confidence of a man who spent 40 years believing that everything was primarily a matter of wanting it badly enough. Success. Security. The visible markers of accomplishment. Visible markers like Catherine's Mercedes, I repeated. Exactly, my mother said, apparently missing the irony entirely. I nodded and cut my turkey into smaller pieces than strictly necessary. The kitchen was warm and smelled like rosemary and family mythology, which tends to accumulate in houses where the same stories have been told year after year until everyone forgets they stories. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I ignored it. Then it vibrated again. And again. Someone's very popular, Catherine said, with the kind of smile that suggested she found my limited social calendar amusing. Is it one of your graphic design clients? I thought you usually worked from home. I let her believe that. The graphic design thing had started as a cover story 15 years ago when I first started building my company, and it had somehow calcified into permanent family doctrine. I did minor freelance design work, enough to give me a plausible income source, enough to justify the apartment in Brooklyn and the deliberately modest lifestyle that I cultivated specifically to remain invisible to their scrutiny. But the real work, the work that had taken me from nobody to somebody, happened in places my family had never thought to look. It happened in corporate boardrooms. It happened in places where I was taken seriously, where my vision was valued. Just checking on a project, I said. Nothing urgent. My phone vibrated again. A text from Marcus Stone, my VP of Operations, emergency. Federal Air Traffic Control contacted us about the helicopter fleet. They need clearance confirmation for the Westchester landing site. They're calling it a security situation. Should I authorize? The airport was literally 3 miles from my parents' house. I set my phone down carefully and took a sip of wine. You need to think about your future, my mother was saying now. The Thanksgiving speech was accelerating. This was the part that always came at dessert, the part where she outlined all the ways I'd disappointed her while simultaneously pretending to be supportive. You're 31. Most women your age are thinking about marriage, children, building something permanent. And you're still what? I asked. Still taking the bus, my father said. Still living like a college student. Still pretending that your life is a choice instead of what it actually is, which is a consequence of your own poor decision-making. I'd heard this speech so many times that I could recite it from memory. The structure was always the same. The setup, the escalation, the moment where they got real with me because they loved me and I needed to hear the truth. Your sister didn't have to choose between being a professional and having nice things, my mother continued. She understood that you can have both. She understood that hard work means something. And how is Catherine enjoying those fruits? I asked. She's going to Hawaii next month, my mother said triumphantly. A week at a 5-star resort. She's taking the whole family. That's lovely, I said. I'm sure the children will enjoy it. Whereas you'll probably be here, my father said, still riding the bus. I checked my watch again, 12:17 p.m. My phone vibrated again. Another message from Marcus. And another from James Chen, my CEO. And another from Patricia Ramirez, my chief financial officer. I need to use the bathroom, I said, standing up. Of course, dear, my mother said, her hand waving dismissively. I locked myself in the downstairs bathroom and called Marcus immediately. What's happening? I asked without preamble. It's the helicopter fleet, Marcus said, his voice tight. FAA contacted us about landing clearance. They said it's a security matter. They need authorization to land here in Westchester. I told them I needed to confirm with you first. How many helicopters? All of them, Marcus said. 18 aircraft. They're coming from the Newark maintenance facility. They said they needed to reposition the fleet and this is the optimal landing site. I flagged it as unusual because you specifically said never to bring the fleet anywhere near your family. I closed my eyes. The FAA didn't randomly decide to land helicopter fleets. Someone had called them deliberately. Who called? I asked. Patricia, Marcus said. Your CFO. She said it was time your family knew who you actually are. Authorize the landing, I said. Tell them to use the Westchester airfield and coordinate with local authorities. Make it visible. I want my family to see what's happening here. You're sure? He asked. I'm sure, I said. It's time. I hung up and looked at myself in the mirror. I was wearing a sweater that had cost more than my parents probably thought I earned in a month. I was wearing shoes that had been handmade in Italy. I was wearing earrings that had belonged to a woman who built one of the first international shipping companies in the 19th century, a woman whose business acumen had been completely erased from family history because she had the grave sin of being female. I'd bought those earrings at auction specifically because of her story. I went back to the dining room where my mother had already started serving the pumpkin pie. Eat quickly, I said, sitting back down at the table. Something's happening. What do you mean? My mother asked, her hand freezing halfway to cutting the pie. I mean that very shortly, you're going to understand what I've actually been doing for the past decade, I said, and then we're going to have a different conversation about cars and public transportation and what it means to measure someone's success. We heard it first as a distant sound, the distinctive thump-thump-thump of helicopter rotors. My mother's fork clattered to her plate. Is that, she started. Yes, I said. That's the beginning of my fleet approaching. The sound got louder. Then we heard it through the windows, a full fleet of helicopters, 18 of them, moving in perfect formation toward the Westchester airfield 3 miles away. They appeared over the trees like something from a blockbuster film, their bodies gleaming in the November sunlight. Each one marked with the same logo, a stylized compass rose with the letters Meridian Aviation written underneath. Meridian Aviation. My company. Worth $2.8 billion. My sister Catherine actually gasped. My father stood up. My mother just stared, her understanding of the world rearranging itself in real time. What is this? My mother asked, her voice very small. That's my helicopter fleet, I said quietly, my voice calm despite the enormity of what I was revealing. All 18 of them. They're worth approximately $180 million combined. But that's really just the most visible asset. I own the company that operates them. I own Meridian Aviation. I also own the medical transport company that uses these helicopters for emergency rescue operations, the division that is responsible for transporting critical patients across the entire Northeast Corridor. I also own the cargo division that contracts with every major shipper in the country. I own the infrastructure company that manages air traffic coordination and landing rights for aviation operations across this entire region. Together, they comprise a holding company called Meridian Holdings, which is worth $2.8 billion. That's not an estimate. That's the valuation from last quarter's board assessment. That's real money. That's real assets. That's a real empire. My father sat down very slowly, like someone had removed his chair without asking permission. I didn't want a car, I continued, speaking carefully. Because each word mattered now, because I didn't need to own a car. I own the sky, essentially. I control the infrastructure that moves people and goods across this region. Catherine owns a Mercedes. Mercedes. Do you understand the irony? I own 17 other aircraft. I own everything she's using as a marker of success. I own stakes in the rail companies. I own shares in the companies that maintain the roads that your cars drive on. I own everything you've been using as markers of success, metrics of achievement, while I've been quietly, systematically building an empire that you didn't even know existed. An empire that operates right under your nose. An empire that saves lives. An empire that matters. The helicopter fleet was gone now, heading toward the landing field, the sound fading into the distance. Why didn't you tell us? My mother asked. Because every time I've tried to tell you about my work, you've dismissed it. I said, because you looked at everything I did and automatically decided it wasn't worth anything because I was the one doing it. Because you've spent so much time deciding that I'm a disappointment that you never bothered to actually ask what I was doing. You just assumed. My father cleared his throat. How long has this been happening? Since I left Northwestern, I said. 15 years of building something you decided was a failure. 15 years of being the disappointment while I became a billionaire. 15 years of listening to you compare me to Catherine while I quietly became richer than both of you will ever be. Catherine was staring at me like she didn't recognize me. Her hand reached for her phone, presumably to Google me, presumably to confirm that I was telling the truth. Meridian Aviation has saved 847 lives this year alone through its emergency medical transport division, I said. We've prevented an estimated 1,200 accidents. We're responsible for approximately 4,000 jobs across the region. And nobody in this room knew any of that because you were all too busy being disappointed in me to ask. My mother stood up suddenly, her chair scraping backward against the tile floor with a sound that cut through the room like a knife. I need some air, she said, her voice very small now. The confidence that had characterized her entire Thanksgiving speech completely evaporated. She walked toward the kitchen, and I followed her because this was the moment I'd been waiting for. This was the moment where everything changed. In the kitchen, my mother sat at the counter like someone had drained her of all structural integrity, like all her assumptions and expectations had suddenly been revealed to be made of paper. She was staring at the window where the helicopters were no longer visible, but I could tell she was seeing something else entirely, the ghost of the narrative she'd constructed, the way she'd dismissed me for 15 years, the assumption that she'd understood who I was. I'm sorry, she said finally. I'm sorry that we made you feel like you had to hide this. You made me feel like I had to be someone you could be proud of, I said. And when I couldn't be that person on your terms, I decided to be someone you could be proud of on mine. It just took a while. We would have been proud, she said. If we'd understood. Maybe, I said. But the issue was that I wanted something different than what you wanted for me. I wanted to build something. You wanted me to have things. Those are fundamentally different goals. But at least now you understand what I was actually doing. My father appeared in the doorway. He looked older somehow. I'm sorry, he said, and it sounded like he meant it. I know, I said. Back in the dining room, Catherine had indeed already pulled up my company information on her iPad. She was scrolling through articles about Meridian Aviation's emergency response work. You've been doing medical transport, she asked. Without telling your cardiac surgeon sister? We operate in different markets, I said. Also, you were busy being disappointed in me. She laughed, actually laughed, and set her iPad down. Fair point. But we should talk about this. I know people. I could introduce you. I'd like that, I said. We ate the rest of the Thanksgiving dinner in a different atmosphere. The food tasted better. The conversation was less careful. My mother stopped asking about my car and started asking about my business model. My father asked specific questions about revenue streams. Catherine asked about my technology. It wasn't quite love. But it was understanding, which in some ways is more important. After dinner, I stood out in the backyard and watched the November sun setting over Westchester, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed almost too beautiful for what had just happened inside. Tomorrow the news would be everywhere. Tomorrow the narrative of my life would be rewritten in 1,000 different ways by journalists who barely understood what IED actually built. Tomorrow would be chaos. But tonight, for just a moment, I allowed myself the deep satisfaction of having my family finally see me, really see me, instead of the disappointing version they deconstructed in their minds over the course of 15 years. I allowed myself to feel what I'd been too focused to feel while building, vindication. My phone rang. It was Marcus. The FAA just called back, he said. They want to know if we can expand our emergency response network to the West Coast. They're considering us for a major federal contract. Tell them yes, I said. Tell them we can have a proposal ready by next week. Victoria, Marcus said, your mother just called my office. She wanted to know what your favorite restaurant is because she wants to take you to dinner next week to celebrate. Tell her the Balthazar in Soho, I said. And tell her I'd like that very much. Sometimes the best revenge isn't proving people wrong. It's just succeeding so magnificently that they have no choice but to understand that they were never the judges of your worth. Tomorrow I would be the CEO of a $2.8 billion company again. But tonight, I was just a daughter who'd finally let her family see her. Sometimes that's everything.